What if everything you ever owned was taken from you? Not by thieves or strangers, but by the very people you once trusted, your own neighbors. What if your kindness was weaponized against you, twisted into something monstrous that threatened to destroy everything you had built? This is exactly what happened to me when my Homeowners Association exploited a simple act of generosity and turned my life upside down. What started as a friendly agreement turned into a nightmare of manipulation, betrayal, and a desperate struggle for control over my own property. Before we dive into this shocking tale of greed and corruption, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you won't miss any of our incredible stories. Now, let me tell you how my life was turned into a battleground by a power-hungry HOA and how I fought back against the very community I thought I was helping. It all started when I received a formal letter from a lawyer informing me that my Uncle Raymond had left me his storage facility on Oakwood Drive, just outside the Willow Creek neighborhood. The unexpected inheritance caught me off guard. I hadn't been particularly close to Uncle Raymond, but he was known for his stubborn independence and prickly personality. I remember the stories of how he would chase away nosy neighbors and peddlers alike, guarding his privacy like a dragon hoarding treasure. The place itself wasn't massive, covering about 5,000 square feet, divided into 20 individual units, a small office that smelled faintly of old paper and engine oil, and surrounded by a rusty chain-link fence that had clearly seen better days. It needed paint, structural repairs, and probably a new roof, but overall, it was functional. Uncle Raymond had maintained it just well enough to keep it running, but had clearly neglected aesthetic upgrades. This was a place meant to serve a purpose, not to win any beauty awards. I felt a weird sense of responsibility looking at the photos. This wasn't just a property, it was a piece of my family's legacy, a part of my uncle that had been left to me as a symbol of trust and continuation. The idea of simply selling it felt like abandoning something he had poured years of his life into. To most people, it was just an old storage facility, but to me, it was something more, a connection of family, to memories, to roots that went deeper than just bricks and concrete. Uncle Raymond might have been difficult, but he was still family. And somehow, holding on to his property felt like preserving a piece of him. I remembered visiting him as a kid, watching him tinker with engines in his garage while he grumbled about HOA regulations and city inspectors poking their noses where they didn't belong. His stubbornness wasn't just anger, it was principle. Raymond believed in taking care of what was his without anyone else telling him how to do it. His words echoed in my mind. Never let anyone tell you what to do with what you own. It's yours, and yours alone. It was one of the few things he'd ever truly try to teach me. I couldn't let his legacy be destroyed by the very kind of control he despised. But I had no idea it would soon become the battleground for a fight that would test everything I thought I knew about decency, integrity, and community. What I thought was an opportunity to honor my family's legacy would soon turn into a nightmare that threatened everything I held dear. "What are you going to do with a storage facility?" my wife, Laura, asked me, raising an eyebrow as I showed her the property photos. "Sell it. We could finally afford that bathroom renovation you've been dreaming about. And you've been talking about updating the backyard, too. This money could make all that happen." "I guess so," I replied hesitantly. "But it might also bring in some steady monthly income if I keep it. Maybe even build something that lasts. And what if it becomes more than just a dusty, old storage space? It could be something good." Laura looked at me thoughtfully. "Well, that's true. But maintaining a storage facility is a big responsibility. And if you're planning to rent out units, there's insurance, taxes, and a lot of hassle involved." She sighed. "But it could be a good investment, I suppose." Before I could decide, our doorbell rang. The chime echoed through the house like an omen. It was Margaret Sanders, the president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. She had a knack for knowing everyone's business before they even did. "I heard about your recent inheritance, Nathan." "Congratulations," she chirped, her smile overly bright and far too eager. Her posture was stiff, but her eyes gleamed with a greedy curiosity. Margaret went on to explain how the HOA was struggling to find a place to store their Christmas and Halloween decorations, lawn maintenance tools, playground equipment, and other community items. According to her, the storage shed behind the clubhouse was not only falling apart, but also infested with rodents, making it unsafe for anyone to enter. She painted a picture of children nearly getting hurt because of misplaced tools and how the HOA was desperately looking for a solution. "Would you be willing to let us use just a tiny section of your property temporarily?" she asked, her eyes gleaming with faux sincerity. "Just until we can raise the funds for a proper storage facility. It would be such a wonderful gesture of community spirit." Her flattery and appeal to my goodwill chipped away at my hesitation. I reluctantly agreed to let them use one unit for a short period until I made a final decision about the facility. After all, what harm could a little generosity do? It was supposed to be a temporary favor, a friendly gesture to help my community. But deep down, something felt off. Margaret practically skipped out of my house with joy, her smile a little too wide, her gratitude a little too polished, as if she had expected me to say yes all along. The uneasy feeling in my gut twisted tighter, but I pushed it aside, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. I kept trying to justify my decision, telling myself that I was simply helping my community, doing something good. And yet, doubt gnawed at me like a constant itch I couldn't scratch. What if I was being too harsh? What if refusing their request would make me the villain of the neighborhood? Was I overreacting, letting suspicion taint what was supposed to be an act of generosity? But then again, what if I was right? The conflict spiraled through my mind, leaving me tangled in a web of guilt, paranoia, and insecurity. I had always been taught to be kind, to be a good neighbor. But in that moment, I had no idea that my kindness was about to be ruthlessly exploited, and I was going to pay the price for being too nice. 3 days later, I drove to the property to clear out some of Uncle Raymond's belongings, only to find chaos. Absolute, uncontrolled chaos. The entire front of the property was swarmed with cars, pickup trucks, and even a boat being unloaded. There were families carrying couches, televisions, crates of tools, and even antique furniture that looked as though it belonged in a museum. The air was filled with the sound of engines idling, children shouting, and neighbors exchanging jovial conversations as they unloaded their lives into what was supposed to be my storage facility. It felt surreal, like watching a disaster unfold from a distance. I parked my car at the edge of the property, my hands shaking as I took in the unbelievable scene. People were cramming their things into various units without a second thought. They scurried around like ants in a disturbed colony, claiming every available inch of space they could find. To my utter disbelief, Margaret was in the center of it all, clipboard in hand, directing them like some kind of air traffic controller. No, the Harrison's antique dresser goes into Unit 4, and the Markson's exercise equipment. Yes, pile it all into Unit 8. Margaret called out commands with the efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this day far longer than I ever could have anticipated. I forced my way through the crowd, my voice trembling with both fury and panic. "What's going on here?" I shouted over the noise. My chest tightened with panic as I realized just how far out of control this situation had become. The entire scene felt like a nightmare unfolding before my eyes. This was far beyond the simple arrangement I had agreed to. Cars were backed up in every direction, engines idling as impatient drivers waited for their turn to unload mountains of belongings. Someone was even trying to maneuver a full-sized recreational vehicle into the lot, its tires tearing up the grass on the far end of the property. To my horror, I saw more people lining up outside, all waiting their turn to drop off whatever they pleased. "Oh, Nathan, isn't this wonderful?" Margaret gushed with a sickening enthusiasm that felt more like mockery than gratitude. "Everyone is so grateful. It's truly a community effort." Her tone was filled with feigned delight, as if this disaster was some sort of charity event that I should be proud to support. The sight was overwhelming. Children were running through the open units, playing hide-and-seek as their parents dumped boxes and furniture into spaces meant to be mine. Strangers laughed and chatted as if they were at a neighborhood picnic instead of trespassing on my property. The sheer disrespect of it all made my stomach churn. It was a complete invasion, an utter disregard for my ownership, and I was starting to realize Margaret had planned this from the very beginning. What? We agreed on 1 unit for HOA equipment, not whatever this is, I exclaimed, my eyes wide in horror as people continued unloading their belongings into what was supposed to be my property. My voice trembled with shock and frustration, feeling the weight of what was rapidly spiraling out of control. How had things escalated so quickly? How had my small act of kindness turned into this nightmarish circus? Margaret's expression tightened, her eyes narrowing as she readied her well-rehearsed response. Actually, we had an emergency board meeting, she said with an air of authority, her voice dripping with condescension. And it was unanimously decided to amend the HOA bylaws. Since you've offered the facility as a community resource, everyone has equal rights to it now. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I could feel my heartbeat thundering in my ears, the sheer audacity of what she was claiming making me lightheaded. But I never agreed to this. I protested, my voice cracking under the strain of desperation. You manipulated this whole situation. This isn't what I offered. This isn't what I signed up for. You've twisted everything to suit your own needs. Margaret's gaze turned icy, her voice lowering to a chillingly calm tone. Are you really going to go back on your word and disappoint the entire neighborhood? Think about how that will look, Nathan. The community newsletter is already printing a feature about your generosity. Backing out now would make you look like a fraud. And trust me, everyone will hear about it. All of them will know how you went back on your supposed generosity. She folded her arms as if she'd already won. The malicious glint in her eyes was unmistakable. Margaret was not only determined to force me into compliance, but to ruin me socially if I dared to oppose her. As I dug deeper into her motivations, it became clear this wasn't just about asserting power. It was about covering up something far more sinister. Rumors began circulating that the HOA had been funneling funds through bogus contracts and inflated maintenance fees, money that mysteriously vanished into the pockets of a select few. Margaret was doing more than trying to control my property. She was desperately trying to silence anyone who might expose her scheme. The lengths she was willing to go to were terrifying, and I knew I was now more than just a target. I was a threat to her carefully constructed empire. I had never felt so completely powerless. How had a simple favor turned into a nightmare that was now threatening to swallow me whole? And how far was Margaret willing to go to ensure I complied with her twisted scheme? Her words stung, not because they were true, but because I knew she had already poisoned the well. The damage was already done. I glanced around, noticing several of the homeowners watching us curiously, their expressions ranging from concern to suspicion. My reputation was already being torn apart. The looks of distrust in their eyes made my skin crawl, a suffocating pressure building up in my chest. Feeling cornered, I left that day with a terrible sense of unease clawing at my gut. I could feel the anxiety gripping me like a vice, refusing to let go. My sleep was restless, plagued with nightmares of losing everything I owned. And as the days went by, things only got worse. Flyers were distributed to residents, encouraging them to utilize the newly designated community resource and praising my supposed altruism. People I'd never even met approached me on the street to thank me for my kindness. Some even shook my hand, their expressions full of admiration that felt sickeningly misplaced. Every word of gratitude felt like salt being rubbed into a wound. Margaret had crafted a narrative that painted me as a willing participant, a generous benefactor who had graciously offered his property for community use. It was a carefully engineered campaign designed to manipulate public perception, using words like community hero and neighborhood unity to pressure me into compliance. Margaret understood the power of social pressure, and she wielded it like a weapon, turning my own neighbors against me before I even realized what was happening. And she wasn't just spreading the lie through the newsletter. She was actively calling neighbors, knocking on doors, and holding impromptu HOA meetings where she painted me as a deceitful manipulator who had tried to make the community look bad by going back on a generous offer. Margaret twisted the narrative with a chilling precision. She told everyone that I had offered the property as a community resource only to inflate its value, planning to force everyone to pay ridiculous fees once they became dependent on it. She claimed I was trying to extort the community and profit off of their desperation. Soon, the whispers and stares weren't just from a few people. They were from everyone. Parents held their kids' hands tighter when I walked by. Neighbors who once waved and made small talk now turned away the moment they saw me. And every attempt I made to explain my side of the story only seemed to confirm their worst suspicions. Margaret had poisoned the well, and now the entire neighborhood viewed me as nothing more than a selfish liar. I was beginning to feel like a prisoner, trapped by my own goodwill, my reputation now a weapon being wielded against me. Invitations to neighborhood events, block parties, holiday celebrations, even casual barbecues dried up overnight. No one wanted to be associated with the selfish liar who had supposedly promised the community access to his property and then tried to go back on his word. I overheard conversations that weren't meant for my ears, neighbors muttering about how greed always shows its true face eventually. Rumors twisted the truth beyond recognition, making me out to be some conniving landlord trying to manipulate the entire neighborhood for profit. Children who once played freely in my yard now hurried past with wide, nervous eyes, their parents glaring at me from across the street as if I were contagion. It was social exile, a deliberate effort to isolate and punish me until I gave in to their demands. Margaret's scheme was working better than she could have ever planned. I couldn't walk my own street without feeling eyes boring into me, whispers buzzing like gnats in my ears. Neighbors I'd once shared casual conversations with now crossed the street to avoid me. Children who used to wave at me from their front yards were hurried inside by their parents. People I'd once considered friends had either turned against me or chosen to stay silent, afraid of being targeted next. The betrayal burned in my chest, and every time I thought about confronting Margaret, the smug satisfaction on her face was all I could see. The isolation was suffocating, and I knew I had to do something before it consumed me entirely. Something had to be done, and I needed to figure out how to fight back before everything I owned was stripped away from me. But maybe I wasn't the only one being targeted. Maybe there were others who had been bullied, manipulated, or financially exploited by Margaret and her cronies. If I was going to have any chance of fighting back, I needed allies. Over the next few days, I began speaking quietly to other residents, those who had given me sympathetic looks or muttered warnings under their breath. That's how I met Rick, a retired contractor who had once tried to build a shed on his property, only to be buried under endless violation notices until he gave up. And then there was Sarah, a single mother who'd been fined repeatedly for minor infractions until she paid a suspiciously large convenience fee to the HOA to make the violations go away. One by one, stories of exploitation began to pile up. Margaret's iron grip over the community wasn't just about enforcing rules. It was about controlling people through fear, manipulation, and greed. And the more I uncovered, the more determined I became to expose everything. I wasn't going to fight this battle alone, and I wasn't going to let Margaret destroy everything I cared about. The plan wasn't just about taking Margaret down. It was about giving the community a voice. And that meant building something bigger than just a legal case. Every night, I met with Rick, Sarah, and others who had been wronged by the HOA's corruption. We didn't just collect evidence. We created a support network, a safe space where people could share their stories and connect over the injustices they had endured. It wasn't just about gathering proof. It was about uniting the neighborhood against a common enemy. I compiled documents, video recordings, and written testimonies from multiple residents who had been extorted or threatened by Margaret and her allies. We reached out to a local attorney willing to take our case pro bono, someone who despised HOA corruption as much as we did. Our group grew stronger each day, a force bound by a shared purpose to end the tyranny Margaret had unleashed upon our community. But we knew that simply filing a lawsuit wouldn't be enough. Margaret controlled public perception, and the only way to defeat her was to expose her lies in front of everyone she had manipulated. We needed a stage, a moment where she couldn't hide behind her fake smile and well-practiced speeches. And the upcoming HOA meeting was the perfect opportunity. I arrived at the community center early, armed with stacks of printed evidence and a digital presentation that would leave no room for doubt. Margaret was already there, seated at the head of the table, her expression cool and dismissive. But her eyes narrowed when she saw the number of residents filing into the room. More than she had anticipated. Much more. When the meeting began, Margaret wasted no time trying to assert her authority, listing new bylaw amendments and increased fines for various violations. But before she could proceed, I stood up. Actually, Margaret, I think everyone here deserves to hear the truth. I announced, my voice steady and loud, about what you've been doing to this community, about the lies, about the money you've stolen. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Margaret's face twisted into a forced smile. Nathan, this isn't the time for baseless accusations. We're here to discuss. No, we're here to discuss why you've been draining money from this community for years, using false fines and manipulated contracts to line your own pockets. I interrupted, my words sharp as knives. And I have the proof right here. With a nod to Rick, he started the projector. Documents, contracts with inflated prices, and emails threatening residents into compliance appeared on the screen. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Angry voices shouted over one another. You've been stealing from us for years, someone shouted. All those fines, all those fake violations. You did this to us, another voice added, their tone sharp with betrayal. The anger was palpable, a storm building within the room. People who had once feared speaking up were now demanding answers, demanding justice. This is slander, Margaret shrieked, her composure cracking. None of this is true. It's all true. And more importantly, it's all recorded. I replied, holding up a USB drive. Everything you've been trying to hide. Everything you try to blame on the rest of us. Margaret's control was crumbling before her eyes. Within days, our attorney filed a lawsuit against Margaret and the corrupt HOA board members. The news spread like wildfire, and soon enough, reporters were knocking on my door, asking about the neighborhood scandal. With the evidence now public, Margaret had nowhere to hide. The fallout was swift and brutal. Margaret resigned from the HOA, fleeing the community with her reputation in tatters. But justice didn't end there. Days later, Margaret's front door was greeted by county investigators. Cameras caught her pale, panicked expression as they escorted her away for questioning about embezzlement and fraud. The HOA's financial crimes were finally coming to light, and there would be no escaping accountability. The county prosecutor launched an investigation into the fraudulent contracts and missing funds. The HOA board was dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up, this time by people who truly cared about the neighborhood. And as for me, I rebuilt the storage facility the way I wanted. But not just for myself. I transformed it into a real community center, open to everyone. A place where people could store items, hold events, or simply gather and enjoy each other's company. The overwhelming support from my neighbors, many of whom had once turned their backs on me, proved that true community comes from unity, not control. We held a grand opening celebration, and almost everyone from the neighborhood showed up, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to be part of something real, something good. As I looked around at the smiling faces, the laughter of children playing nearby, I felt the weight that had been crushing me finally lift. My kindness hadn't been a mistake. The mistake had been letting others exploit it. But now, that kindness had turned into something stronger, something powerful. I had reclaimed my property. I had reclaimed my name. And in doing so, I had given the community something better than any HOA could ever offer, true freedom and trust. And as I stood there, surrounded by the people who now truly supported me, I knew one thing for sure. Uncle Raymond would have been proud. Lesson learned. The lesson learned from this story is that kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. While being generous and compassionate is admirable, we must also remain vigilant and protect ourselves from those who might exploit our good intentions. It's essential to stand up for what's right, even when the odds are against us. By refusing to back down and seeking allies, The protagonist not only reclaimed his property, but also restored justice to his community. Meaningful message. The meaningful message here is about resilience, courage, and the power of unity. When facing corruption and injustice, one person's bravery can inspire others to take action. The story shows that even when the situation feels hopeless, perseverance and collaboration can overcome even the most powerful adversaries. It also reminds us that integrity and standing up for the truth are worth fighting for, no matter how difficult the battle. Personal takeaway. From my perspective, this story beautifully illustrates how easily power can be abused when people remain silent. But it also proves that standing up against wrongdoing, even when it feels overwhelming, is never futile. By finding courage, building alliances, and refusing to be silenced, you can create real change. It's a reminder that sometimes you have to fight back to protect what's yours and to ensure others don't fall victim to the same corruption. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more gripping tales of resilience, justice, and emotional triumphs, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Story Precious, and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest content. Your support helps us continue sharing incredible stories that inspire and empower. Stay tuned for more.